All right, so let's start with the big story that we're tracking on WION this hour, where the United States and NATO allies have issued a pretty stark warning to Russia, saying that there will be some very serious consequences if Russia were to act against Ukraine. The NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and also the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken had some pretty strong words for Russia as the foreign ministers of NATO gathered in Latvia to discuss the increased military activity along the Ukrainian border.
There will be a high price to pay for Russia if they once again use force against the independent sovereign nation Ukraine. We have demonstrated our ability to impose costs, economic, political actions, and also over the years also increased our military presence in this region just to make sure that all allies are totally defended and protected against any Russian aggressive actions.
Any escalatory actions by Russia would be of great concern to the United States, as they would to Latvia, and any renewed aggression would trigger serious consequences.
The Russian President Vladimir Putin responded by cautioning the West not to cross the Kremlin's red lines.
Дело не в том, чтобы вводить там войска, не вводить, воевать, не воевать, а дело в том, чтобы наладить отношения по созданию более справедливого, устойчивого развития и учета интересов в области безопасности всех участников международной деятельности. Вот если мы будем искренне к этому стремиться, то никаких угроз никто не будет испытывать.
And Putin's remarks seemed designed to echo the fears of Europe's Cold War missile crisis. Putin warned that it will respond if the West were to continue to help Kiev expand its military infrastructure, pointing out that it would take just 5 minutes for a hypersonic weapon to be deployed. Now, this veiled threat has come after Russia successfully tested a new sea-based hypersonic missile which will come into service by next year. The missile flies at 9 times the speed of sound. Now, the West is looking pretty nervous at the moment about reports that Russia is increasing its military presence at the Ukrainian border. This new build-up follows a similar situation earlier this year when Russia had gathered nearly about 100,000 troops at the border, but later announced a drawdown. All right, now to give us more insights in terms of what's actually playing at the border between Russia and Ukraine, we're joined in by our correspondent Julia Chapman, who's joining us live from Moscow. Julia, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this broadcast on WION. We've heard a lot of saber rattling between Russia and the United States and NATO, but what actually is happening on the ground between Russia and Ukraine? Why has the troop buildup taken place?
Well, at the moment, we understand that as of this morning that Russia has started carrying out winter military drills in its southern military region, and part of that includes areas on the Ukrainian border. These, as we understand it, were not necessarily planned drills, at least not those that were made public. And it comes after a couple of weeks of warnings from the United States and from intelligence defense firms saying that there was a buildup of military hardware and troops on the Russian side of its border with Ukraine. Russia has denied any kind of intention to invade, but there certainly have been fears that it could do so. The Kremlin saying that it has a right to move its own troops within its own borders, but it certainly has heightened tensions between Moscow and Kiev in recent weeks, and indeed with Kiev's partners in Brussels and Washington. We've been seeing an increasing of support in the rhetoric coming out of the United States and from NATO as well towards Ukraine, and that has certainly been met with some ire here in Moscow, with of course the Russians believing that Ukraine should not ever become a member of NATO. And although it looks like that is still a very distant prospect, there certainly has been a closeness growing between Kiev and NATO, with the Ukrainian foreign minister taking part in these talks that have been held in Riga over the last couple of days with NATO foreign ministers. But NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was very keen to stress yesterday that there is a difference between NATO allies and Ukraine, that Ukraine is simply a partner that NATO provides political support for.
Absolutely, indeed. That, of course, is the crux of this issue, isn't it? Ukraine is not a part of the NATO alliance, but still it was stressed that any kind of a invasion or military action by the Russians will result in consequences for Russia. This is what NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been reaffirming. But what kind of consequences can NATO actually inflict on Russia?
The million-dollar question, and it's very difficult to know how far NATO would go if there were to be an incursion of Russian forces onto Ukrainian soil beyond the support that is being offered for the Russian-backed rebels who are already fighting a conflict in eastern Ukraine and have been for more than 7 years now. But certainly the Ukrainians already believe that there is an incursion on Ukrainian soil, of course, with the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and Russia believes that Crimea now belongs to the Russian Federation. But as to what support, what kind of measures might be taken by NATO if there were to be some other red lines crossed, it's very difficult to say, but certainly the extension of support, at least verbally, suggests to Moscow that it would be willing to take some sort of military intervention, and that is of great concern to Russian officials. Indeed, Russian officials, as we've been hearing from President Vladimir Putin speaking yesterday at an investment forum, he said that Russia's red lines would constitute any advanced military systems being placed by NATO on Ukrainian territory. So a very clear explanation from the Russian president of what he would deem to be unacceptable.
All right, lastly, a similar sort of a build-up was also witnessed earlier in the month of April, where again a similar number of over 100,000 Russian troops were moved towards the Ukrainian border. But later that troop build-up came down after a drawdown. Will we also again witness a similar way for this crisis to also resolve itself?
It's always difficult to anticipate the Kremlin's next moves, but there are certainly experts who believe that this build-up, which Russia hasn't fully acknowledged is actually taking place. It says there are only around 10,000 forces in the area, as opposed to the 100,000 that Kiev has claimed is around the Ukrainian border. But certainly there was a suggestion that earlier in the year that build-up was drawn down when the Russian president met with his US counterpart, Joe Biden, for the first time since Biden took power. And indeed, the Kremlin has been talking in recent weeks of a planned meeting, a virtual summit between the two leaders before the end of the year. The White House hasn't confirmed any such plan, but there is certainly a suggestion among the expert community that this build-up might be an attempt to put pressure on Washington to get to the table with Russia once again.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Julia Chapman, for joining us and getting us all those details there. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.